It was quite the scene on Route 177 in Westport this morning as 12 News cameras captured FBI, Westport Police, and Massachusetts State Police gang unit on the property of Hells Angels clubhouses.
The black smoke billowing into the Hunter Valley sky on that quiet Wednesday morning told only part of the story. As flames ripped through the compound of what had been Australia's most impenetrable motorcycle clubhouse, emergency services racing toward the Portland Street address had no idea they were witnessing the final chapter of a 6-decade empire. But this story doesn't begin with fire and destruction. It begins with something far more mundane, yet infinitely more dangerous in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. The Fortress on Portland Street.
I don't put a vehicle across the entrance to my street, do I?
2013, eh?
For over 60 years, the Gladiators Motorcycle Club had been a fixture in Maitland, their clubhouse standing like a medieval castle in suburban Australia. The compound wasn't just a meeting place, it was a statement of permanence. Towering wrought iron gates, styled like a medieval fortress, protected corrugated iron and dark brick structures that housed decades of outlaw motorcycle history. Security cameras monitored every approach. Floodlights could illuminate the entire perimeter. Heavy steel doors and tinted windows suggested that whatever happened inside was meant to stay inside. The most distinctive feature wasn't the fortress-like architecture, it was the swimming pool. Tiled across the bottom was the Gladiators logo, visible even from satellite images, a bold declaration of ownership that could be seen from the sky. This wasn't a temporary outpost or a rented space. This was a monument to longevity in a world where most organizations measured their existence in years, not decades. Inside the clubhouse, the walls displayed memorabilia, old photos, patches, club flags, and framed articles detailing their decades-long history. Founded in 1960, the Gladiators represented one of Australia's oldest outlaw motorcycle clubs, their patches carrying the weight of historical significance that commanded respect even from rivals. Their network extended beyond Maitland to include chapters in Grafton and Gunnedah, creating a regional presence that had weathered police raids, internal conflicts, and the rise and fall of numerous rival organizations. But what the members gathering for their annual general meeting party didn't know was that their fortress was about to face its greatest test. Not from police or traditional rivals, but from a global organization with resources and ruthlessness that would make their 6 decades of survival experience irrelevant within a matter of days. The Gladiators weren't just criminals hiding behind motorcycle culture. They were embedded in their community in complex ways. The club became known for organizing the infamous bike, car, and tattoo show at the Maitland Showgrounds and later at the Old Maitland Jail. The Grafton chapter gained recognition for hosting Jacka Bash boxing exhibitions. These public-facing activities created identities that extended beyond purely outlaw enterprises, allowing the club to establish community connections while maintaining their rebellious status. This dual existence, part community institution, part criminal organization, had allowed the Gladiators to survive when other clubs collapsed under police pressure or internal strife. They understood that longevity required more than just intimidation and illegal income. It demanded becoming part of the fabric of their region, creating relationships and dependencies that made their removal complicated and costly for authorities. But this community integration also created vulnerabilities. Public events meant public exposure. Community connections meant more people observing and potentially reporting on club activities. Most dangerously, the respect and reputation built over 6 decades created expectations of behavior and response that could be exploited by rivals who understood the unwritten codes governing outlaw motorcycle culture. When respect becomes currency.
So I said, let me find out and let me ask. So I called Minneapolis Custom Cycles because I knew Pat owned it.
In the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, respect isn't just a courtesy, it's the currency that prevents wars. Every gesture, every interaction, every moment of acknowledgement or dismissal carries weight that outsiders struggle to understand. When members of different clubs encounter each other, particularly at formal events like annual general meeting parties. Elaborate protocols govern behavior. These unwritten rules have evolved over decades to prevent the kind of violence that attracts unwanted law enforcement attention while maintaining the hierarchical structures that define outlaw culture. The handshake is perhaps the most fundamental of these rituals. It acknowledges the other person's status, shows respect for their organization, and demonstrates that despite rivalry or competition, certain civilized standards will be maintained. To refuse a handshake isn't just rude, it's a public declaration of disrespect that demands response. The refusal communicates that the person being snubbed is considered unworthy of basic recognition, that their status means nothing, and that their organization deserves no courtesy. What happened at that Gladiators AGM party would soon demonstrate how quickly respect can transform into violence, how individual actions can doom entire organizations, and how 6 decades of careful relationship building can be destroyed by a single moment of poor judgment. But the full consequences wouldn't become apparent until masked figures began surrounding the fortress-like compound in numbers that made resistance impossible. According to the anonymous source, who would later reveal the true origins of the conflict, the atmosphere at the Gladiators' annual general meeting party was initially positive. Most members were respectful when interacting with guests from other clubs. The evening was proceeding according to the established social protocols that allowed rival organizations to coexist in the same space without violence. Music played, drinks flowed, and the careful dance of outlaw motorcycle diplomacy unfolded as it had countless times before. But then came the moment that would change everything. One Gladiators member refused to shake his hand twice and completely snubbed him. The identity of the Hells Angels member who was disrespected remains unknown, but his status within that organization clearly demanded a response. The fact that the refusal happened twice suggests the Hells Angels member initially gave the Gladiators member an opportunity to correct his behavior, extending his hand again after the first snub. When respect was refused a second time, the situation moved beyond simple misunderstanding into deliberate insult. This double refusal created a bit of tension that rippled through the party. Other members from both clubs would have witnessed the interaction. In outlaw motorcycle culture, such public disrespect cannot be ignored without appearing weak. The Hells Angels member who was snubbed faced a choice: respond immediately and risk escalating the situation into violence at a social event, or handle the matter through official channels that would involve his club's leadership. He chose the latter, a decision that would prove far more catastrophic for the Gladiators than any individual confrontation might have been. The ultimatum that split a brotherhood. What happened next reveals the sophisticated nature of power dynamics within outlaw motorcycle club hierarchies. Rather than seeking personal revenge, the disrespected Hells Angels member reported the incident to his leadership, who then issued a formal ultimatum to the Gladiators organization. Deal with their own guy for disrespecting the Angels, or the Angels would step in themselves. This ultimatum wasn't simply about punishment. It was a test of the Gladiators' internal discipline and their willingness to maintain the respect protocols that governed interclub relationships. The Hells Angels were essentially saying, prove that your organization has standards and can police its own members' behavior, or we'll assume you've collectively chosen disrespect and will respond accordingly. But what the Hells Angels may not have anticipated, or perhaps exactly what they hoped for, was that this ultimatum would shatter the Gladiators from within, creating the perfect conditions for something far more ambitious than simple retribution. Within days, masked figures would surround the fortress with an offer that would make the original disrespect seem trivial by comparison. The Gladiators' response revealed fatal internal divisions that had likely been building for years beneath the surface of brotherhood unity. Half the club agreed to sort it out, but others refused and wanted to stand their ground. This split wasn't just about how to handle one disrespectful member. It reflected deeper disagreements about the club's direction, leadership, and relationship with larger organizations. Some members apparently favored discipline and diplomatic resolution, understanding that maintaining respect protocols was essential for organizational survival. Others viewed the ultimatum itself as disrespectful, believing that no outside organization should dictate internal Gladiators' discipline. This fracture exploded within the club, creating the kind of internal chaos that makes organizations vulnerable to external exploitation. When half the membership opposes the other half on a fundamental question of club authority and response, effective decision-making becomes impossible. Leadership cannot maintain order when the organization splits into opposing factions. Security becomes compromised when members question whether their brothers can be trusted. Most dangerously, word of internal division inevitably reaches rivals who understand that divided clubs cannot mount coherent resistance to external pressure. The speed with which this internal disagreement escalated suggests that the handshake incident was merely the catalyst for pre-existing tensions within the Gladiators. Perhaps older members who had built the club's reputation over 6 decades disagreed with younger members about respect protocols. Maybe financial pressures or previous police actions had created stress within the organization. Possibly leadership disputes had been simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a crisis to bring them into the open. Whatever the underlying causes, the Hells Angels ultimatum exposed fault lines that made the entire organization vulnerable to exploitation. The point of no return.
As part of the government crackdown, the Finks were the first biker club in the country to be declared a criminal organisation, under the kind of laws rarely used in modern democracies.
As the Gladiators struggled with internal division, the Hells Angels were making their own calculations. According to the anonymous source, the Angels didn't start the fire, but just saw an opening and took full advantage. This suggests that what followed wasn't simply revenge for disrespect, but a strategic opportunity to achieve something the Hells Angels had perhaps been planning for much longer: expansion into the Hunter region. The Hells Angels are a global organization with international resources and experience in territorial expansion. Their approach to growing their Australian presence follows patterns they've refined worldwide: identify vulnerable clubs, exploit weaknesses, overwhelm resistance, and absorb territory. The Gladiators' internal fracture presented exactly the kind of opportunity that experienced expansion strategists recognize and act upon quickly, before the target organization can recover its stability. The decision was made. Within days, residents of the quiet Portland Street area would witness something unprecedented: a convoy of up to 50 motorcycles converging on the medieval fortress, their riders' faces concealed behind balaclavas, carrying an ultimatum that would end 60 years of independence in a single conversation. The Hells Angels' response to the Gladiators' internal division was swift and overwhelming. Rather than waiting to see if the club could resolve its problems internally, they moved to capitalize on the weakness immediately. Intelligence gathering within outlaw motorcycle networks is sophisticated and rapid. Word of the Gladiators' internal conflict would have reached Hells Angels leadership within hours of the split occurring. Strategic planning sessions would have followed, with senior members calculating the resources needed for a successful takeover and the timing required to prevent the Gladiators from recovering their unity. The formation of the Hells Angels Hunter Crew chapter, officially established in 2025 according to their website, suggests this expansion had been planned well before the handshake incident provided justification. The infrastructure for regional expansion was already being developed: leadership structures, recruitment targets, territorial objectives. The Gladiators' internal crisis simply accelerated a timeline that was already in motion, providing perfect cover for an aggressive move that might otherwise have seemed unprovoked. The Hells Angels' existing Steel City chapter in Newcastle provided the operational base for Hunter region expansion. From Newcastle, they could deploy resources, coordinate logistics, and maintain supply lines for sustained operations in Maitland. This geographic advantage, combined with their international backing and experience, gave them capabilities that the fracturing Gladiators couldn't match, even under the best circumstances. The internal division merely eliminated their last hope of coherent resistance. The storm arrives. The morning when everything changed began like any other in the Portland Street area. Residents went about their routines, unaware that their quiet neighborhood was about to become the center of one of the most significant power shifts in Australian outlaw motorcycle history. The fortress-like compound stood as it had for decades, its medieval gates and security cameras maintaining their eternal vigil over what its occupants believed was impregnable territory. Then came the sound of engines, not one or two motorcycles, but dozens. A convoy that witnesses would later describe as resembling a military operation more than a social visit. Up to 50 Hells Angels members arrived at the Gladiators Clubhouse, their faces concealed behind balaclavas, creating an intimidating presence that left no doubt about their intentions. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a demonstration of overwhelming force designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance. What happened next would be described by witnesses as chaos and a well-planned operation, but the true genius of the Hells Angels approach wouldn't become apparent until much later, when investigators began piecing together how months of intelligence gathering had identified the perfect moment to strike. The handshake incident hadn't caused this confrontation. It had merely provided the excuse for something far more calculated. The visual impact of 50 motorcycles surrounding the compound was carefully choreographed for maximum psychological effect. The balaclavas ensured that individual members couldn't be identified by security cameras or witnesses, while creating an anonymous, threatening presence that suggested military-level organization. The sheer number of participants demonstrated resources that the fractured gladiators couldn't hope to match. Even if they had been unified and prepared, facing such overwhelming numbers would have been daunting. Divided as they were, resistance was impossible. The timing of the operation revealed sophisticated planning, arriving when most members would be present but not necessarily alert or prepared for confrontation, maximized the element of surprise. The Hells Angels would have studied the compound's security arrangements, identified optimal approach routes, and calculated response times for law enforcement. Every element of the operation appeared designed to achieve maximum impact while minimizing the risk of escalation into violence that might draw unwanted police attention. Witnesses described the Hells Angels' arrival as chaos, but from the attacker's perspective, it represented careful orchestration. The convoy's formation, the coordinated deployment around the compound, and the disciplined behavior of 50 potentially armed individuals suggests command structure and operational planning worthy of military analysis. This wasn't gang violence. It was strategic territorial acquisition executed with precision that demonstrated the Hells Angels' experience in such operations worldwide. The ultimatum that ended an empire. Standing before the assembled Gladiators members, surrounded by 50 Hells Angels with concealed faces, the ultimatum was delivered with the kind of stark simplicity that eliminates confusion. Patch over or get out. 3 words that represented the end of 60 years of independence and the beginning of a new order in the Hunter region. In outlaw motorcycle culture, patching over represents the ultimate surrender. Members must literally remove their original club patches and replace them with those of the conquering organization. It's not just changing jackets, it's abandoning identity, surrendering brotherhood bonds built over decades, and accepting subordinate status within the hierarchy of the victorious club. For many members, their club patches aren't just symbols, they're tattooed on their bodies, representing permanent commitment that can't be undone even if the patches are removed. The psychological trauma of this moment cannot be overstated. Imagine being told that your family name, your heritage, and your identity must be discarded and replaced with that of your conquerors. Some Gladiators members would choose to walk away entirely, rather than submit to this humiliation, but others would make calculations that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The binary nature of the ultimatum was strategically brilliant. By offering no middle ground, no negotiation, no compromise, no gradual transition, the Hells Angels forced immediate decisions that prevented the Gladiators from regrouping or organizing resistance. Patch over or get out eliminated extended deliberation that might have allowed the fractured club to reunify around opposition to the takeover. Each member faced an individual choice that had to be made in the moment, under pressure, without time for collective consultation. The demand to surrender their colors struck at the very heart of outlaw motorcycle identity. These patches represent more than club membership. They symbolize brotherhood, shared sacrifice, and years of commitment that can't be easily discarded. Many members have invested decades of their lives building relationships and status within their organization. The Hells Angels ultimatum demanded they treat all of that history as worthless, replaceable with new allegiances that would always mark them as conquered, rather than founding members. Some Gladiators members reportedly left on their own, rather than face the choice between submission and confrontation. This option, voluntary departure from the scene, represented the only way to maintain personal dignity while avoiding both the humiliation of patching over and the danger of resistance. These members essentially chose exile from the outlaw motorcycle world rather than accepting subordinate status within a conquering organization. Their departure further weakened the Gladiators by removing potential resistance while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of opposition. Others found themselves facing impossible calculations: submit to the Hells Angels and become the lowest-ranking members of an organization they had previously considered rivals, starting over despite decades of experience and relationships, or refuse and face the consequences from 50 potentially armed adversaries who had already demonstrated their willingness to use overwhelming force. The reported internal division that had preceded this confrontation meant that members couldn't even count on unified support from their own brothers in whatever decision they made. The aftermath of conquest.
It was quite the scene on Route 177 in Westport this morning as 12 News cameras captured FBI, Westport Police, and Massachusetts State Police gang unit on the property of Hells Angels clubhouses.
The immediate aftermath of the Hells Angels ultimatum created a power vacuum that rippled throughout the Hunter region's underworld. The Gladiators' six-decade control of Maitland territory had created networks of relationships, business arrangements, and territorial understandings that suddenly became obsolete. Local businesses accustomed to dealing with familiar Gladiators' faces now had to adapt to new relationships with Hells Angels members. Protection arrangements that had operated for years needed renegotiation. Territory that had been respected for decades came under new management. The speed of the club's collapse surprised even experienced observers of outlaw motorcycle politics. According to the anonymous source, the internal disagreement over how to respond to the Hells Angels' original ultimatum about the handshake incident had exploded, leading to the club being shut down nationwide, all because of one member's actions. This rapid disintegration suggests that the Gladiators' problems extended far beyond the immediate confrontation with the Hells Angels. Structural weaknesses had been building for years, requiring only the right catalyst to trigger complete organizational failure. But the Hells Angels weren't content with simply absorbing the Gladiators' Maitland territory. Their strategic vision extended throughout the entire Hunter region, and what happened next would demonstrate their willingness to use any means necessary to solidify their newly claimed dominance. The fortress that had stood for 60 years was about to face its final test. The psychological impact on surviving Gladiators members who chose neither to patch over nor to leave entirely created ongoing security concerns for both the Hells Angels and law enforcement. These displaced individuals possessed intimate knowledge of club operations, territorial arrangements, and criminal activities, making them potential intelligence sources for rivals or authorities. Their loyalty to their former organization, combined with resentment over its destruction, created possibilities for revenge actions that could destabilize the Hells Angels' newly claimed territory. Law enforcement agencies faced immediate challenges in adapting their intelligence networks to account for the power shift. Officers who had spent years building knowledge about Gladiators' operations, membership hierarchies, and territorial boundaries suddenly found their expertise partially obsolete. New relationships had to be developed with Hells Angels members now controlling Maitland territory. Surveillance targets shifted as familiar faces disappeared and new ones emerged. The entire regional criminal ecosystem required reassessment and mapping. The economic implications extended beyond immediate law enforcement concerns. The Gladiators' long-established presence in Maitland had created revenue streams from both legal and illegal activities that now came under Hells Angels' control. Protection payments from businesses, preferred access to entertainment venues, employment opportunities for associates, and territories for merchandise distribution. All of these economic networks required integration into the Hells Angels' existing operations. The disruption of established arrangements created opportunities for other criminal organizations to exploit the temporary instability while the new power structure solidified. The fortress burns. Days after the Hells Angels' ultimatum shattered the Gladiators organization, the fortress-like clubhouse that had stood as a symbol of permanence for 60 years faced its ultimate destruction. The morning of the firebombing began quietly, with no indication that Portland Street was about to witness one of the most dramatic acts of property destruction in Australian outlaw motorcycle history. Just after 10 a.m., on what witnesses described as a quiet Wednesday morning, the peace was shattered by an explosion that sent black smoke billowing into the Hunter Valley sky. A vehicle, already set alight, had been driven directly through the compound's gates and into the storage shed, creating an impact that sent flames ripping through the compound. The timing, broad daylight rather than under cover of darkness, suggested the perpetrators wanted maximum visibility for their message. The burning car smashing through those medieval-style gates represented more than property destruction. It was the final erasure of the Gladiators' territorial claims, a fire that would consume not just buildings, but the last remnants of 60 years of organizational history. But the presence of a badly burned man at the scene would raise questions about whether this act of destruction had gone according to plan. The technical sophistication of the attack revealed careful planning rather than impulsive revenge. The vehicle was already set alight before being driven through the gates, indicating preparation and coordination. The target selection, hitting the gates and storage shed rather than the main clubhouse structure, demonstrated tactical thinking designed to maximize symbolic impact while potentially destroying evidence of club activities that might be valuable to law enforcement investigations. Gates represent the boundary between club territory and the outside world. Their destruction symbolically eliminated this separation and announced that the old territorial claims no longer applied. Emergency services arrived within minutes of the explosion, but the damage was already done. The flames had already consumed much of what they were intended to destroy, leaving parts of the clubhouse exterior scorched and melted from intense heat. The rapid response time suggests that the fire was reported immediately, possibly by neighbors disturbed by the sound of the crash and explosion. However, the attackers had calculated correctly. Their message would be delivered regardless of how quickly authorities responded. The discovery of a 63-year-old man at the scene with burns, who was subsequently arrested under police guard, added complexity to what initially appeared to be a straightforward arson case. His presence raised immediate questions. Was he involved in the firebombing, possibly as the driver of the burning vehicle? Was he a Gladiators member attempting to defend the property? Or was he an innocent bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? His injuries suggested direct involvement with the fire, but his exact role remained unclear as he was taken into custody for medical treatment and questioning. Law enforcement mobilizes.
On the Hells Angels. At 4 rendezvous points, officers prepare to simultaneously raid 4 clubhouses.
All right, let's move on.
The handover of the firebombing investigation to the State Crime Command's Raptor Squad demonstrated how seriously authorities viewed these developments. Created specifically to disrupt and dismantle outlaw motorcycle gangs, the Raptor Squad employs sophisticated surveillance techniques, intelligence networks, and strategic enforcement to monitor every move in the outlaw landscape. Their involvement signaled that this incident was being treated not as isolated property damage, but as part of a broader power struggle with regional implications. The establishment of a crime scene at the Portland Street Clubhouse triggered a methodical forensic response that would examine every aspect of the attack. Burn patterns would reveal points of origin and accelerant types, potentially connecting to specific individuals with access to particular materials. Vehicle remnants, despite extensive fire damage, retain identifiable components that create investigative pathways. Stolen vehicle histories, parts suppliers, modification patterns unique to specific mechanical shops. The reported presence of potential bullet casings introduced ballistic evidence that might link to firearms used in previous incidents. The Raptor Squad's involvement meant that this investigation would extend far beyond the immediate incident. Their mandate includes disrupting entire criminal networks, and the Hells Angels' expansion into Maitland territory had created exactly the kind of power shift that specialized units are designed to monitor and contain. But what they discovered during their investigation would reveal just how calculated and extensive the territorial takeover had been. Intelligence gathering during power transitions between outlaw motorcycle clubs requires resources beyond traditional criminal investigations. Automated license plate readers deployed around known gathering spots track movement patterns that might indicate preparation for retaliation or consolidation activities. Cell tower data, obtained with proper legal authority, helps map communication networks and physical movements before and after significant incidents. Social media monitoring provides insights into club dynamics not observable through traditional surveillance, as members often reveal information through routine online activities despite strict organizational prohibitions against such disclosures. The firebombing likely triggered immediate tactical responses beyond the visible emergency services deployment. Unmarked surveillance positions would be established around secondary locations, known members' residences, businesses associated with either club, and potential flashpoints for retaliatory violence. Informants throughout the region would receive urgent contact from their handlers, seeking immediate intelligence about planned responses from either organization. Interstate intelligence sharing would accelerate, as Victoria and Queensland authorities would be alerted to potential movement of reinforcements across state lines. Prosecutorial strategies following the incident would focus on specific criminal violations rather than targeting the power struggle itself. The firebombing created multiple charging possibilities: arson, malicious damage, endangering life, possibly attempted murder depending on circumstances, and various conspiracy charges if multiple perpetrators were involved. Reports of possible gunfire around the time of the incident could add weapons offenses if confirmed through forensic evidence or reliable witness testimony. Each charge creates leverage for potential cooperation from lower-ranking members facing significant prison time. Media circus and public perception.
11:30, and they're still working to identify who did it. Claire Garcia was enjoying her Sunday morning when she heard
gunshots. There was about 6 of them. I don't know how severe it was. We heard it very close, but we didn't really get a chance to see what was going on.
The media's response to the Hells Angels takeover and subsequent firebombing followed predictable patterns of sensationalism over nuance. The Daily Telegraph's characterization of the Hells Angels' expansion as an aggressive power grab created narratives designed to capture public attention rather than explain the complex cultural dynamics actually driving the conflict. Headlines featuring terms like outlaw underworld, tensions boiling over, and brewing war satisfied audience expectations for dramatic content, while potentially oversimplifying the sophisticated territorial strategies at play. The visual elements of the story proved irresistible to news editors seeking compelling content. Descriptions of the Gladiators' fortress-like compound with its medieval-style gates, the swimming pool emblazoned with their logo, and the dramatic black smoke billowing after the firebombing created imagery that captured audience attention regardless of the accompanying analysis. The contrast between the clubhouse's permanent, castle-like appearance and its ultimate destruction by fire provided symbolic narrative elements that news directors understood would resonate with viewers accustomed to simplified good versus evil storylines. But the most significant aspect of media coverage wasn't what it revealed about the conflict. It was how the coverage itself became part of the power struggle. When newspapers reported that other clubs were reaching out to the Gladiators, offering support, such statements potentially influenced decision-making within the Hells Angels and other organizations, creating situations where reporting didn't simply document events, but potentially shaped them. The anonymous source's alternative explanation for the conflict's origins highlighted the gap between public perception and insider reality. While mainstream media painted a picture of territorial ambition and criminal enterprise expansion, the source claimed the entire situation stemmed from a handshake refusal that escalated through internal division rather than strategic planning. This discrepancy revealed how media narratives often reduce complex cultural conflicts to simplified power struggles. missing the intricate honor codes and personal relationships that frequently drive decisions in the outlaw world. Historical context appeared selectively in most coverage, focusing primarily on criminal allegations rather than the club's complete community integration over decades. The careful cataloging of police raids, weapons charges, and suspected drug activities created one-dimensional portraits that, while not inaccurate, lacked broader context about these organizations' complex relationships with their communities. The rare mentions of the Gladiators' Jacka Bash boxing exhibitions and their bike, car, and tattoo shows at the Maitland Showgrounds represented acknowledgements of activities beyond alleged criminality. But these elements received minimal attention compared to the dramatic confrontation and destruction. The cyclical relationship between media coverage and club behavior created feedback loops that potentially escalated tensions. Organizations aware of being observed through news channels might modify their actions for strategic media impact, using visible displays of strength or unity to communicate messages to rivals, law enforcement, and their own membership. The Hells Angels reported bolstering of their presence in regional strongholds following media coverage of the Gladiators' situation suggested awareness that public perception could influence the calculations of other clubs considering resistance or submission. The broader strategic picture.
I watch a lot of video, a lot of archive video, a lot of current video, and I don't recall seeing near one
The Hells Angels' successful takeover of Gladiators' territory represented more than a local power shift. It demonstrated a calculated expansion strategy that had been developing for years. Their website's prominent featuring of the Hunter Crew chapter, established in 2025, complementing their existing Steel City chapter in Newcastle, revealed systematic territorial acquisition, moving inland from coastal strongholds. This expansion pattern follows globally tested methodologies, refined through decades of international growth, establishing anchor chapters in major urban centers, then systematically building satellite operations in surrounding regions. The targeting of Maitland specifically showed sophisticated strategic analysis. Positioned as a gateway to the broader Hunter Valley, the location provides critical access points to transportation routes, industrial areas, and rural communities. By establishing control in Maitland, the Hells Angels gained influence over movement throughout the entire region, rather than merely acquiring another clubhouse. Their convoy approach, arriving with up to 50 members in a show of overwhelming force, demonstrated the resources they were willing to commit to regional dominance, signaling to other clubs that this territorial push represented serious long-term commitment rather than temporary opportunism. What makes this expansion particularly significant is its timing and targets. The Hells Angels didn't choose to challenge weak, recently formed clubs with limited community connections. They deliberately targeted one of Australia's oldest outlaw motorcycle organizations, with 60 years of territorial claims and community integration. This bold move sent a clear message throughout the outlaw landscape. No club is too established, too respected, or too entrenched to be immune from takeover. Regional expansion by major international clubs typically follows recognizable patterns that local organizations struggle to counter effectively. Intelligence gathering and relationship building with local criminal networks precedes direct action by months or years. The identification of vulnerable clubs, often those weakened by police pressure, aging membership, or internal conflict, provides target selection criteria that maximize success probability while minimizing resource expenditure. The decisive show of force, ultimatum delivery, and swift territorial absorption represent final phases of processes that begin long before community members notice increased motorcycle traffic in their neighborhoods. The ripple effects throughout the Hunter region's criminal ecosystem extended far beyond the immediate participants. Local drug distribution networks, protection arrangements, and informal criminal relationships built over decades required renegotiation under new management. Smaller criminal organizations that had operated under Gladiators' protection or in cooperation with their territorial claims now faced uncertainty about continued operations. Business owners accustomed to dealing with familiar faces for protection or other services had to adapt to new relationships with Hells Angels representatives who brought different organizational cultures and expectations. The sustainability of the Hells Angels expansion depended partly on their ability to integrate acquired territory into their existing organizational structure without creating internal conflicts. Former Gladiators members who chose to patch over would enter probationary periods within the Hells Angels hierarchy, surrendering their previous status regardless of their experience or local knowledge. This integration process, while humiliating for the absorbed members, provides the conquering organization with valuable intelligence about local operations, business relationships, and potential threats that external observation couldn't reveal. Interclub alliance networks. The Daily Telegraph's report that other outlaw motorcycle clubs across New South Wales are believed to have reached out to the Gladiators, offering support, revealed the complex alliance dynamics that territorial expansion triggers throughout outlaw networks. These emerging alliances weren't built on friendship or shared values, but on pragmatic recognition of common threats. Every club observing the Gladiators' rapid collapse after 6 decades of independence faced uncomfortable questions about their own vulnerability to similar aggressive expansion by international organizations with superior resources. Interclub alliances in outlaw motorcycle culture operate through sophisticated protocols that balance cooperation with traditional independence. Senior club presidents make initial contact through trusted intermediaries, often using neutral third parties with connections to multiple organizations. Face-to-face meetings occur in carefully selected neutral territory, frequently with multiple chapters represented to demonstrate organizational commitment beyond individual leadership decisions. Support offers range from symbolic gestures of solidarity to practical assistance, manpower for security, temporary safe houses for displaced members, intelligence sharing about rivals' movements, or access to weapons and other resources. But the Hells Angels' response to these developing alliances revealed the calculating nature of their expansion strategy. Rather than backing down when faced with potential coalition opposition, reports suggested they were bolstering their presence in regional strongholds, bringing in additional members and resources to consolidate their territorial gains while preparing for broader resistance. The rarity of these alliance formations made them particularly significant indicators of perceived threat levels throughout the outlaw landscape. Clubs that had maintained rigid independence for decades, sometimes engaging in territorial disputes or business competition with each other, suddenly found common ground in opposing Hells Angels' expansion. This cooperation represented fundamental shifts in regional power calculations, as organizations that had previously viewed each other as rivals or competitors recognized that their individual survival might depend on collective resistance to external conquest. Law enforcement agencies monitored these developing alliances with particular concern, as historically separate or even hostile clubs beginning coordination created new operational possibilities for criminal activities. Intelligence networks that relied on interclub rivalry to prevent large-scale criminal cooperation suddenly faced scenarios where traditional divisions might no longer provide security. The potential for coordinated drug distribution, weapons trafficking, or other criminal enterprises increased dramatically when clubs that had previously competed for territory or markets began sharing information and resources. The sustainability challenges facing these hastily formed alliances would ultimately determine whether the Hells Angels' expansion met organized resistance or continued unopposed. Historical analysis of outlaw motorcycle club coalitions reveals consistent patterns. They typically form in response to immediate external threats, but struggle to maintain cohesion once the crisis passes. Fundamental differences in club culture, historical grievances, and competing economic interests create internal friction that eventually dissolves cooperative arrangements unless external pressure continues to justify the sacrifices required for unity. The psychology of conquest. The psychological warfare preceding the Hells Angels' physical takeover of Gladiators' territory operated on multiple levels that external observers rarely comprehend. The process began months before masked figures surrounded the Portland Street compound, involving subtle tests of resolve, recruitment attempts, targeting individual members, and strategic appearances at events traditionally dominated by the target organization. These preliminary actions created atmospheres of inevitable change that weakened organizational cohesion before direct confrontation became necessary. The binary ultimatum, patch over or get out, represented psychological sophistication that eliminated middle ground options while forcing individual decisions under extreme pressure. This approach prevented the extended deliberation that might have allowed fractured clubs to reunify around opposition to conquest. Each member faced personal choices that had to be made immediately, without collective consultation, creating isolation and uncertainty that facilitated submission while identifying individuals who might require alternative handling. The humiliation rituals involved in patching over served strategic purposes beyond simple dominance demonstration. Former rivals forced to surrender their colors and accept subordinate status within conquering organizations experienced identity destruction that eliminated psychological foundations for future resistance, while creating loyalty bonds based on survival rather than brotherhood. The trauma associated with surrendering club patches extends beyond mere symbol exchange to fundamental identity destruction that affects individuals for years after territorial takeovers. Members who have worn their original colors for decades, building entire personal identities around club membership, face psychological crises comparable to forced exile from family structures. The patches aren't simply logos. They represent brotherhood bonds, shared sacrifices, and community recognition that can't be easily replaced with new organizational affiliations imposed through conquest rather than earned through voluntary association. Probationary periods imposed on former rivals who choose to patch over serve dual psychological functions. They maintain hierarchical distinctions that prevent absorbed members from achieving equal status with original Hells Angels members, while simultaneously testing their commitment to new organizational loyalties through tasks and humiliations designed to break down previous allegiances. This systematic psychological reconstruction ensures that former enemies become reliable subordinates rather than potential internal threats to organizational security. The public nature of the Hells Angels' territorial takeover created demonstration effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Other clubs throughout the region observed not just the practical mechanics of conquest, but the psychological techniques employed to achieve submission without prolonged violence that might attract excessive law enforcement attention. These lessons would influence decision-making in future territorial disputes, as organizations calculated whether resistance or preemptive submission offered better survival prospects when facing similar ultimatums. Environmental and economic consequences. The firebombing's environmental impact extended beyond immediate property damage to create regulatory complications that multiplied legal pressure on surviving club members. The Gladiators clubhouse was reportedly positioned right on the edge of the Hunter River, meaning that firefighting water runoff, fuel spills from the burning vehicle, and toxic smoke could have contaminated local waterways. Environmental protection agencies would become involved alongside criminal investigators, potentially triggering federal violations with significant penalties that extend beyond those directly responsible for the arson to property owners and club officers bearing environmental remediation responsibilities. Economic disruption rippled throughout networks built over the Gladiators' 6-decade presence in Maitland. Local businesses that had operated under informal protection arrangements, mechanics shops that serviced club motorcycles, entertainment venues that hosted events, and suppliers who provided everything from food to security equipment, all faced uncertainty about continued relationships under Hells Angels management. These economic relationships represented substantial value that couldn't be easily quantified, but contributed significantly to both clubs' operational capabilities and community integration. The insurance implications alone created substantial financial pressure at precisely the moment when organizational resources faced maximum strain. Most insurance companies exclude coverage for outlaw motorcycle clubhouses or impose prohibitive premiums, meaning reconstruction required significant out-of-pocket expenditure when the club's income streams simultaneously faced disruption from territorial challenges. Property values in the surrounding area would reflect the increased criminal activity and law enforcement presence associated with territorial disputes. Residential neighbors who had adapted to the Gladiators' long-established presence now faced uncertainty about new occupants' behavior patterns and the potential for ongoing violence during territorial consolidation. Commercial properties near the clubhouse might experience difficulty attracting tenants or customers concerned about safety and law enforcement scrutiny. The broader economic implications extended to legitimate businesses owned by or associated with club members. Restaurants, construction companies, motorcycle dealerships, and other enterprises that employed club members or served their needs faced decisions about continued association with individuals whose organizational affiliations had changed or who faced uncertain legal situations. These economic pressures created additional incentives for former Gladiators members to accept Hells Angels affiliation rather than risk complete social and economic isolation. The final truth: what really started the war. As investigations continued and the smoke literally cleared from the destroyed fortress, the anonymous source's revelation provided the most shocking twist in the entire saga. The conflict that brought down Australia's oldest outlaw motorcycle club, that triggered firebombings and territorial conquest, that mobilized specialized law enforcement units and reshaped regional criminal networks, all of it stemmed from a moment so simple that it seemed almost absurd. One member's refusal to shake hands. One Gladiators member refused to shake his hand twice and completely snubbed him. Those words contained the entire explanation for 60 years of history being erased in a matter of days. Not territorial ambition, not drug trade disputes, not strategic expansion planning, but a handshake refused twice at a party, creating a bit of tension that exploded into organizational collapse when the Hells Angels demanded the Gladiators deal with their own guy for disrespecting the Angels, or the Angels would step in themselves. The source was clear about the Hells Angels' role. The Angels didn't start the fire, but just saw an opening and took full advantage. This revelation reframed the entire narrative from aggressive expansion to opportunistic exploitation. The Hells Angels hadn't necessarily planned to destroy the Gladiators. They had simply recognized that the club's internal fracture over how to respond to their ultimatum created perfect conditions for territorial acquisition that might have taken years to achieve through other means. The speed of collapse. The rapidness with which the entire situation exploded revealed structural vulnerabilities that had likely been developing within the Gladiators for years. The internal division that split the club in half the club agreed to sort it out, but others refused and wanted to stand their ground, suggests that the handshake incident merely catalyzed pre-existing tensions about leadership, direction, and relationships with other organizations. A healthy, unified club might have weathered such a crisis through internal discipline and diplomatic resolution. Instead, the Gladiators' inability to reach consensus on handling the Hells Angels' ultimatum created the fatal weakness that their rivals recognized and exploited. When organizational leadership cannot make coherent decisions, when membership splits into opposing factions, when internal trust breaks down over fundamental questions of respect and response, these conditions create perfect opportunities for external conquest that experienced organizations like the Hells Angels immediately recognize and act upon. The sources claim that the club was shut down nationwide, all because of one member's actions, highlighted how individual behavior can doom entire organizations when internal cohesion is already compromised. The member who refused the handshake may not have intended to destroy his club, but his actions triggered a sequence of events that exposed and exacerbated structural problems that made organizational survival impossible once external pressure was applied. Aftermath and implications. The Hells Angels' successful exploitation of the Gladiators' internal crisis established new realities throughout Australia's outlaw motorcycle landscape. Their Hunter Crew chapter now operates from territory that had been controlled by rivals for 60 years, demonstrating to other clubs that even the most established organizations can fall rapidly when internal unity breaks down. This lesson will influence strategic thinking throughout the outlaw world as clubs reassess their own vulnerabilities and defensive preparations. Law enforcement agencies learned equally important lessons about how quickly regional power structures can shift when international organizations identify opportunities for expansion. The Raptor Squad and similar units must now monitor not just criminal activities, but internal dynamics within target organizations that might create exploitation opportunities for larger rivals. Intelligence gathering must extend beyond external threats to include assessment of organizational health and unity that affects vulnerability to conquest. The most profound implication may be for the concept of territorial permanence in outlaw motorcycle culture. If a 60-year-old club with deep community roots and fortress-like compound can be eliminated within days of internal disagreement, no organization can consider its territory permanently secure. This realization will likely accelerate alliance formations, defensive preparations, and strategic planning throughout Australia's outlaw landscape. The New Order. The Hells Angels' expansion into Maitland represents more than territorial acquisition. It signals the beginning of a new era in Australian outlaw motorcycle politics. Their demonstrated ability to identify internal weaknesses, exploit organizational vulnerabilities, and execute rapid territorial conquest while avoiding prolonged violence that might attract excessive law enforcement attention provides a template that other international clubs will likely study and emulate. The systematic nature of their expansion, establishing the Hunter Crew to complement their Newcastle Steel City chapter, suggests longer-term strategic planning that extends beyond opportunistic exploitation of the Gladiators' crisis. Regional control of transportation corridors, industrial zones, and rural communities creates operational advantages that justify the resources invested in territorial acquisition. The Hells Angels appear committed to permanent presence rather than temporary occupation, meaning their influence will likely continue expanding throughout the Hunter region and beyond. Other clubs observing these developments face difficult strategic choices. Resistance requires resources and unity that few organizations can maintain against international rivals with global support networks. Alliance formation offers potential collective defense, but requires sacrificing independence and sharing territory that clubs have traditionally guarded jealously. Preemptive submission might preserve some organizational autonomy while accepting subordinate status within expanding Hells Angels hierarchy. Lessons in power and vulnerability. The complete story of the Gladiators' collapse provides multiple lessons about power, vulnerability, and survival in criminal organizations that extend beyond outlaw motorcycle culture. Internal unity represents the foundation of organizational security. Without consensus on fundamental issues of leadership and response to external pressure, even the most established institutions become vulnerable to conquest. The handshake incident that started the crisis might seem trivial, but it exposed fractures that made the entire organization indefensible once serious pressure was applied. External pressure often exploits rather than creates internal weaknesses. The Hells Angels' ultimatum about handling the disrespectful member didn't cause the Gladiators' internal division. It revealed and exacerbated problems that had likely been building for years. Organizations that maintain internal cohesion can weather external challenges that destroy those whose foundations have been quietly eroding through neglect or internal conflict. The speed at which everything unraveled, from handshake refusal to organizational collapse in a matter of days, demonstrates how quickly stability can disappear when multiple crisis factors converge. The Gladiators had survived police raids, legal challenges, and rival competition for 6 decades, but they couldn't survive the combination of external pressure and internal division that the handshake incident triggered. The cost of disrespect. In the end, the entire saga comes down to respect, its importance in outlaw culture, the consequences of its absence, and the cascading effects when respect systems break down. The Gladiators member who refused to shake hands may have thought he was making a minor personal statement, but in a culture where respect is currency and disrespect demands response, his actions started a chain reaction that consumed his entire organization. The Hells Angels' response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both respect protocols and organizational psychology. Their ultimatum forced the Gladiators to choose between internal discipline and stubborn independence, knowing that either choice would weaken the organization. When the club split over this decision, the Hells Angels recognized the opportunity immediately and acted with decisive force that eliminated any possibility of recovery. The firebombing that destroyed the fortress-like clubhouse provided the final punctuation mark on this transformation. The building that had stood as a symbol of permanence and territorial control for 60 years was reduced to scorched ruins, its swimming pool logo visible among the debris as a monument to how quickly power can shift in the outlaw world. The 63-year-old man found burned at the scene represented the human cost of these territorial struggles, though his exact role in the incident remained unclear as authorities continued their investigation.